Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We are going to a new course today, the Federalist. Lecture 1 is Publius and the Federalist. And I think most of you probably know what the Federalist is. But for those of you who don't, our founders were extremely learned men, and they actually established a country in argument, in discussion with each other, in trying to convince and persuade each other on what the best form of government would be.
That's right. That's what Hamilton tells us in Federalist 1, the first paper of the series, and we have it posted on the website so you can review it. He says, we have the chance in America, this is after the Revolution, we're existing under the Articles of Confederation, which aren't working that well. He says, we have the opportunity to use our minds, not force, not the normal ways that political regimes are founded or decided, but we can think about what's actually best given who we are, given the principles we believe in, and form a government based on those things, on reason and choice.
And so to persuade their fellow citizens at the time that they needed a new form of government and a better form of government, and to learn what the good principles of government were, three of them, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, got together and started writing newspaper articles. Now, they had a plan already on the whole argument that they were going to make, but it was 85 newspaper articles that were published over the series of more than a year, in which they made the argument for why the Constitution that they were proposing should be ratified, and what are the principles of good government that this Constitution was establishing.
And it's a monumental book in the study of political philosophy. It's in the context of the ratification of the Constitution, but throughout the book, we get political lessons that apply to all men at all times. And Dr. Pistrito brings that out in the course. He makes that point in the first lecture, and then in every lecture thereafter. He helps you as the listener or the viewer understand the timeless principles and the timeless observations about what man is and how they live together in community throughout the book and throughout the course.
If you couldn't tell, we are very excited about this course. It's a course that all Hillsdale students have to take because it's one of the most important things that we should know as Americans. We have tons of resources for this course. We have specific Federalist papers that we have on our site that you can go read. Anti-Federalist papers, we'll get into those in the next episode. But to access these resources, read them, watch the lectures, take the quizzes, take the course, and take a deep dive into understanding how our founders thought of good government, go to hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Now let's turn to Dr. Pistrito in Lecture 1 of the Federalist, Publius and the Federalist.
Welcome to our course on the Federalist. My name is R.J. Pistrito. I'm a professor of politics at Hillsdale College. I also hold the Shipley Chair in the American Constitution and serve as Dean of the Graduate School of Statesmanship at the college. And we're going to go through a course here that we teach very regularly in the School of Statesmanship. It's a course we teach every couple of years. Every graduate student in politics has to go through it. That's how much importance we place on this text. I want to start by addressing that question. Why would we spend so much time going through a text like the Federalist, and why now? After all, the book hasn't changed in a couple of hundred years, obviously. So why this course at this moment in our history? First of all, this book addresses principles that are timeless and that citizens in any republic always need to know. The founders, they understood that our republic would only last if the people themselves were fit for republican government. They knew in a republic, it's based on the consent of the governed, the laws reflect the sentiments of the people. If the people themselves aren't ready for republican government, then it's not going to work very well. They had historical examples. They were very well versed, as we see in the text, with Greek history, with Roman history especially. And the fall of the Roman Republic is clearly very much on their minds. In fact, One of the other Hillsdale online courses is on the rise and the fall of the Roman Republic and provided an important background for the framers. So this is something citizens need to know about regardless of what point we're at in our history as a country. But secondly, there are reasons today, there are reasons why there's something particularly important about recalling the principles of our founding at this moment in our country. I think it's pretty common to hear these days that our nation is extremely divided, that we're at our most divided point perhaps since the 1850s, that obviously very divisive period just prior to the American Civil War. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. Most of our audience will be familiar with Lincoln's famous phrase about a house divided, and that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And in one sense, he's obviously referring to the immediate issue of the moment, the question of slavery, and that you can't have half the country slave and half the country free. But in another respect, slavery was simply a symptom of a deeper divide. And if you look at Lincoln's speeches, especially at that period in the 1850s, the real divide he's worried about is a divide in the country over what our principles are. What does it mean to be in a republic? What does it mean to have government by the consent of the governed, but within a regime whose ultimate aim is to secure the equal natural rights of each citizen? And there's just a big divide on that question in the 1850s, and Lincoln knows it, and I think we face a similar divide today about what our first principles are, and that's why I think that's an apt comparison. Today it's very common to hear talk about the principles of our democracy. You hear references to this phrase, our democracy, in the media and among our political class all the time. It's very common in American domestic politics today to have leaders talk about the opposition as threats to democracy, sometimes almost as if half the country or half the voters in the country are threats to democracy. And so there's a great deal of focus on this question. Now, partly we know this is a typical partisan spin, and that's just part of the ordinary machinations of American politics. Democracy is a good thing, so the things that your side favors are pro-democracy things, and the things that the other side favors, those are anti-democracy things, and that's how the rhetoric works. And that's not that out of the ordinary. But this rhetoric is used for a reason. It's a very powerful rhetoric. And it poses the danger, I think, we become so familiar with it, of obscuring what it is democracy actually means. What is our democracy? What are those principles? What are those most fundamental things that it's so important to understand? Because if democracy is under threat today, and I think surely it is, then it behooves us as citizens to have a very serious conversation about what we mean when we say that. What is democratic government? Once we understand that, we can take a look at how our system is functioning today, and we could figure out, are we living up to our principles? So how does all of that play into the importance of studying so deeply this book that's on our agenda in this course, the Federalist Papers? First of all, I think it's very important to get precise with our language. And college audiences will know already that I'm mixing up two words that, in fact, the framers distinguished and were very careful about. These two words, republic and democracy. And they were not the same thing to the framers. And understanding their difference is very, very critical to understanding our Constitution and the principles that informed it. And I can think of no better source than the Federalist Papers to understand with precision the differences between a republic and a democracy, and especially a pure democracy, about which they were very cautious. So the Federalist is a great way of understanding that question and that distinction. As we're quickly going to see, a major point of difference between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists is over what it means to have a republic. Both sides are Republican. Both sides want Republican government. That's not the difference. The difference is, what does that look like? And does the Constitution, as it's proposed by the Federalists and the framers of the Convention, does that Constitution improve republicanism? Does it get us closer to the best kind of Republican government? Or does it betray it? Does it move us farther away? And so the book is going to address itself, perhaps more than any other question, to that question. Why should we focus on a single book to have this conversation about our first principles and to have this conversation about what a republic is? There are many different ways of learning what the framers thought about the Constitution and the principles of republicanism, after all. One other way, for instance, would be to study the much fuller range of writings and speeches from the founding period. And certainly one should do that. That's part of any serious education about the principles of our country. And in fact, in one of the college's online courses on Constitution 101, we do that. We take you through a lot of those different writings. One shouldn't forego that way of studying the founding. But this way, studying a single text, written principally by two men, three really, but two men principally, is another way, and I think a very fruitful way of doing it. Because it's the explanation of the key features of our form of government, and it's a connection of those features to our first principles, to the reasons why we declared independence in the first place. And it's an explanation that's given by the men who were probably the most responsible for our Constitution looking the way that it does, by Madison and by Hamilton. Right? This isn't to say they were the only important founders or that they were the only influential men at the convention, but certainly you're getting the account from a couple of the men who were right in the thick of it. And we should think about that. You've got these two individuals. We know from history, we know from their writings that they had different views. We know on fundamental questions sometimes they disagreed, and that there were many differences among those who framed the Constitution. Yet in spite of those differences, in spite of the many compromises that we know were made at the convention, as there must be in any such gathering of that many individuals, we know that in spite of those things, Madison and Hamilton themselves believed that a single coherent defense could be made, a single coherent explanation could be made of what the convention did and of principles that justified what the convention did. Now, what this means about the book is that it's not necessarily going to be an account of what, say, Alexander Hamilton by himself would have done in every instance. And it's not going to be an account of what James Madison by himself in every instance would have done. Much of it, obviously, they endorse and agree with and crafted, but not in every instance. What it is instead is a coherent account, again, of what the convention did, which they believe is defensible as a matter of principle. One great indication of this sentiment is that there's really a single author to the book. And I know I just said no, there are these several authors. There's Hamilton, Madison, John Jay as well. But that's not how the authorship is claimed. When these essays are written, they're all signed by the same individual. This individual with this kind of curious Latin name, Publius. So there's only one author as far as the public is concerned. And more on why they chose the name Publius a little bit later. But what's going on here with the selection of just this single figure, we're gonna put everything in the voice of this single person, is that each of the individual authors is subordinating himself in deference to something higher, to this grand project of which they had been a part. They're subordinating themselves to what the convention did. And so you will catch me, for the most part, as we go through the different parts of this book, referring to the author not as Hamilton, not as Madison, even though we know that's basically who wrote it, but as Publius, because we want to underscore that coherence. That's also why you will often hear me referring to the title of the book as The Federalist, even though it is very commonly also referred to as the Federalist Papers. That's an important difference. That title, The Federalist, the reason I use that is because this series of essays was actually planned as a book, and that's the title that was chosen by its authors. Yes, they came out serially. It was as if you were writing a book and were writing one chapter at a time, and as you were writing it, you published the chapters one at a time as you finished them. And that's what they did. This book was planned. The topic of the chapters was planned. The order was planned. Finished in the spring of 1788, began in late 1787, and these were essays published in the leading newspapers of the day, 2 and 3 a week sometimes. They came out so frequently. But by the time that they finished in the spring of 1788, very shortly thereafter, Alexander Hamilton wrote a preface for the book, and it was given the title The Federalist and published. And so that's why you will hear me refer to that book title very often, The Federalist. Let's talk a little bit more as a preliminary matter about the choice of this author, Publius. It's kind of an odd practice. Today, we're not as accustomed to people writing with anonymity. But when you use a pen name like this, the audience doesn't know who the author is. And in this case, the authorship of the Federalist Papers was not known for quite some time. Word would leak out. We knew some papers and the identity of the author long before we knew others. I'm even old enough to remember when I studied this first in school that there was still some dispute about a few of the papers. Historians have finally cobbled together enough evidence to have a pretty certain account of who did what. But they wrote anonymously. And why might they choose to do that? One reason to write anonymously, as opposed to publicizing your own name immediately, is because you want the audience to look at your arguments and not at who the author is. And we all know, I'm sure, when we read pieces in the public press today, if you read them and you look at the author and you know who the author is, if you're like me anyways, you say to yourself, oh, I know what this person's going to say, or I know what their perspective is. And often your read of the arguments is colored by that preconception. And so one advantage of anonymity is you don't know who's saying this, so the only thing you can pay attention to is the arguments themselves. And that's a great advantage, especially when the arguments are as good as they are in this book. Another advantage of anonymity is it allows the authors themselves a freedom to depart from their ordinary views. These are not just philosophers, they're not just people engaged in some high art, they're also politicians, they're statesmen. They represent constituencies. Maybe they have to be careful if they would write things in their own name, and they don't want to disappoint or anger a certain base. You know, somebody like Alexander Hamilton had a base or a constituency among the high Federalists, and maybe he wouldn't have been as free to say some of the things that sound more Madisonian if he had claimed authorship in his own name.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now.
Why was the name Publius chosen? And what does that tell us about what the authors thought they were doing and what they were saying? Well, first of all, it's an indication of how well-versed the authors were in Roman history and how much they had read the historians of ancient Rome and Greece, for that matter. And almost surely they got their account of Publius from Plutarch, the great historian, and his book Lives. And there is a Roman statesman, Publius Publicola, about whom Plutarch writes. And Publius was one of the two annually elected consuls in Rome. As Plutarch tells it, he came to power at a critical juncture in Roman history. His co-consul died. He had an opportunity to consolidate power, but instead he made what many regard as very key reforms that were important in sustaining the Republic. And so you can see, obviously, that the authors of the Federalist wanted to put themselves in a similar vein. Understanding the influence of figures like Publius and of Roman and Greek history in the writing of the Federalist is also very important. You can see in almost every paper how strong the influence of antiquity is. And it's influential in a couple of different ways. First of all, in terms of the ideas that they're talking about. Think of the ideas that flow from the Declaration of Independence and here into the Federalist about natural rights, about concepts of justice by nature and natural law. And these are things that go all the way back to the important Greek philosophers, to Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. But also just as influential are the examples, are the instances of statesmanship and the examples from history of what happens to these ideas in the crucible of real events. And both Greece and Rome are very much on their mind, and the historians of Greece and Rome. And the examples they're getting are obviously taken from authors like Thucydides or Polybius. The influence of the classical period, it's why we spend so much time at the college talking about the classics, and it's why many of our online courses talk about antiquity, is because here you can see, even though you're talking centuries and centuries later, just how influential those ideas and those examples were on America's statesmen. Now, before we dive into the specifics of the book, we should talk about a couple of its broad purposes. And to me, this is one of the most fascinating things about studying this book in a deep and a thorough way, because there are obviously a couple of different missions going on here at the same time. And if you're familiar with the language of the Federalist, it is just one of the highest and one of the most elegant examples of written rhetoric. And it's even more impressive when you consider the purposes that are often in tension with one another, that the authors have to kind of balance and make sure they cover, and to do it so coherently and so beautifully and so artfully is, I think, one of the great accomplishments of this work. So I want to focus on what I think are two fundamental goals of the book. And one of these goals is obvious, or should be very obvious, and the other, which I think is the more important goal, is actually often ignored by a lot of commentators. And these two goals can often be in tension with one another, and this can be seen, for example, especially in the first part of the Federalist, one might say the first half of the Federalist, where Publius is trying to do two things at the same time. On the one hand, he is trying to reassure the states, and it's in the states, after all, where ratification will either take place or not take place. He's trying to reassure the states that their stature, that their power, that their position will not be unduly diminished. And so there are all kinds of reassurances like that in the text. On the other hand, as he's going through and making these reassurances, he has to tell the truth. He has to describe the national government as it actually exists in the Constitution. And the truth is, the role of states will be diminished. And the states are going to lose some of the powers that they had retained under the Articles of Confederation. And Publius not only has to say that, but in fact, as you see in the first half of the book, he's amazingly upfront about that. And yet this boldness, this directness about the new powers of the national government is interspersed all along with his reassurances to the states of the different ways in which they will retain their role. And this is just weaved together, paper to paper, and sometimes even within a single paper. And it's done, I think, at a very high, a very sophisticated level. So let's talk about these goals of the book. The first goal is to win ratification for the Constitution. That's the whole point. So these papers were published to influence the ratification debates in the different states that were going on. Initially, they were published to influence the ratification debate in New York, in the Gazette of the United States, but very quickly they were spread to outlets all over the country, as opinion pieces are regularly done today, although certainly not by the same means. So it's not purely a philosophic treatise. What they're going through, this is not what Plato did in the Republic. It's not a sort of abstract exercise. These are statesmen. These are politicians involved in a real controversy. These are real events. The outcome of this debate is of tremendous consequence, and they want to win. That's the point. And so one has to understand the book in part that way. That's one purpose. The second purpose, however, is a more enduring purpose, a deeper purpose. It's to use the occasion of the immediate debate to teach eternal principles, to teach the principles of good government. We said at the outset that one should study works like the Federalist because they talk about principles that all citizens in a republic need to know. And the Federalists understood that if the Constitution were to be sustained over a long period of time, that they would have to have buy-in, for lack of a better way of putting it, by the citizens. That a republic, no matter how cleverly you design its forms, and you get a lot of argument in the Federalist about how clever the different mechanisms are and the different institutions and the arrangements, and they're going to defend those to the hilt, and as we'll see. But no matter how good a job they do of that, ultimately what's going to matter is the people themselves. And so the people have to be educated. They have to want Republican government, and they have to understand what it is, and they have to be ready to defend it. And this requires not just winning the immediate political debate, it requires actual persuasion. And so the arguments have to be aimed not just at winning, but at convincing. And not just themselves, not just their own partisans, but their opponents. It's not just about beating the anti-federalists, who are, after all, as we'll talk about in the next session, they're fellow founders. But it's about persuading them. It's about winning them over to your side, to your understanding of what it means to have a republic. And so these are the two broad missions of the book. And Publius weaves them together. But it's just amazing the accomplishment of this when you consider sometimes how much in tension those two things can be. Because what it means is Publius has to sometimes speak the truth about what a republic is and what it requires. And sometimes that truth may not be something that the voters want to hear. It may be a lesson that it would be better for the narrow purpose, for just the immediate political moment, if you kept quiet about it. But they can't keep quiet about it. They have to say it, because in addition to arguing, they're also teaching. Now, if we're saying that it's very important in a republic for the citizens to have a proper understanding of what it means to be in a republic, further evidence of this can be found in our history when we have strayed off the Republican theme. And we've done it in different ways at different times. Sometimes we can veer in the direction of becoming too democratic, of understanding a republic as more of a direct democracy, as more immediately dependent upon, and something that should be so immediately responsive to every whim of public opinion. In the 1780s, as we will talk about in a later session, you have state governments which had set up systems which were extremely democratic, where you had very pure forms of majority rule, where the legislatures were very dependent upon public opinion and had very strong dominance in their systems of government. And the question is, did this highly democratized, this highly majoritarian system of republicanism, was it true to our Republican principles? Or maybe an even better example, a more familiar example, might be the debate over slavery extension in the 1850s. Think of the debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas in the 1850s over what Douglas called popular sovereignty. The idea that we weren't going to decide the slavery question on a matter of principle, that, hey, everyone has equal natural rights as a human being, and therefore slavery is unjust, regardless of what the voters of a particular state might feel at a particular time. No, Stephen Douglas's view was, I'm kind of indifferent about slavery. I don't really care whether it's voted up or down. I just want there to be a vote. And if 51% of the voters in a state want to enslave 49% of the voters, that's democracy. That's what it means to have a republic. And that would be another example, I would argue, of where we strayed to an overly democratic and overly majoritarian view of republicanism. Lincoln himself knew that. It was the object of many of his speeches in the 1850s. On the other hand, just as it's possible to have an overly democratic view, it's also possible to stray away from the principles of self-government. And arguably, this may well be our problem today. We go to the other extreme, where rule by the people is pushed aside. And I think this is one conclusion that we're going to come around to at the end of the course, that I think a criticism that the Federalists would have of us today, and this is notwithstanding their great caution about purer forms of democracy, but I think one real criticism that they would have of us today is that there's actually too little self-governing today, that there's too little government by the citizens. And this is equally problematic in a republic. And so you don't want to go to one extreme or the other. It's very important for the citizens to have a proper education of what the ideal republic is. And that's what this book is about. Next, before we dive into the text and figure out what the Federalists have to say about this, we're going to talk about their adversaries. We're going to talk about the anti-Federalists, because so much of what the Federalists wrote was in conversation with the anti-Federalist objectors to the Constitution. And the result of that conversation is, I think, an enduring lesson about what the founders thought republicanism needed to be.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.